Okay, so for this month's meeting, we're going to be talking about Vectorworks hatches and tiles and stipples, um, all of which are essentially 2D rendering um, objects or techniques, with the exception of a certain application of hatches. So let's go ahead and start with hatches, which are certainly of those three the most legacy kind of Vectorworks feature. So a hatch is essentially a series of rules that are applied to two-dimensional lines and can be used for any kind of a repeated element, such as a random stipple pattern, or not fully random, a repeated stipple pattern, uh, brick coursing, masonry coursing, whatnot. Um, this is a very old feature of Vectorworks, and the hatch creator interface is uh, hasn't been updated in a while, so it's a bit esoteric to use. And let's go ahead and have a look at that. I'm going to do that by creating a new hatch. So I'm going to go to the resource manager over here, and let's go to my file. And over here, you can see that I'm showing my hatch resources only. I'm going to right click and create a new hatch. And let's go ahead and start off by naming that what it is, which is this will be a tile, 12 by 36, 1/3 running bond. Great. And so you can see that there's this preview window, and there are these three control points. There's actually four, but one of them is currently hidden. And the first thing that I do is I start by setting all of my numeric controls for the hatch to a Cartesian rather than a polar system. So I'll click on the polar and then click on the Cartesian just to kind of get that reset. And you can see I now have X and Y dimensions. And you can see that you can define the hatch either in page units for something that you always want to scale the same regardless of the layer scale, or for world units, which is typically I'm using hatches for real world objects like tile patterns. So that's what I'm going to use in this case. And you can see when I do that, all these values change. So each repetition of a single line is considered a level within the hatch editor. So right now there's only one level, there's only one line rule. And the line starts here at this black dot. That's the start or the origin. And it repeats every 4 feet to the right and 4 feet up, hence the 45-degree angle. And then it's offset by this value, roughly 8.5 inches to the right and 8.5 inches down. And that's what this is up here. So what I find is useful is to go ahead and graphically set your hatch to approximately what you want, and then go ahead and finish it off over here with these numeric controls. So I'm going to drag this over, and as I do, you see two things. One, of course, it becomes horizontal, and these 2 points or these two control handles which were overlapped and therefore you couldn't really differentiate them, have now become separated. And so actually the repeat is from the origin, which is the black dot, all the way to the white square. And then the dash factor, or the gap, some value between 0 and 1 inclusive, is defined by this black square, right? So if I want it to be roughly half the length, you can see I can slide it here. In this case, I want it to be a completely solid line. So I'm just going to drag it over here, and you can see that it's got a factor of 1. And there's also a snap radius here by default at 6 pixels as I'm moving these control points around so that things can snap to each other. And then this is my offset. So that's the gap of my coursing. It can be down, in which case it's negative, or up, in which case it's positive. Doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and make the repeat 3 feet. And I'm just choosing 3 feet arbitrarily because this is a 3-foot long tile, large format tile. And then the offset is just going to be 0. I'm going to set it to 12. So there's my horizontal coursing. It occurs every 12 inches, right? And that is one level. I can give a background fill to my overall tile. I'm going to go ahead and now create a new level. So I'm going to add a level here. And what it'll do is it'll start with the one that I already have and essentially duplicate it. So I'll add a level, and you can see how it's duplicated it and offset it by 4 inches. So in this case, I want the vertical coursing. So I'll go ahead and rotate this roughly 90 degrees. And I got to rotate it from the endpoint here. Do you see how it's kind of snapping into place very nicely? I'll snap that to here. And because it's a 1/3 bond, I'm going to have a vertical joint every third row that's going to line up. So I'll snap to here, and then I'll set this down, and you see that's all snapping very nicely to exactly 1/3. And then, of course, this is 3 feet long. So again, it's snapping to 3 feet because that is the length of my level 1 line, right? So I didn't really have to do very much cleaning up at all over here with these numeric controls. Now I can give each of my levels a unique color, and that's kind of helpful as I'm working, just to help me visualize the different levels. And I'll go ahead and make everything the same thickness. So this is the line thickness that just makes it easy for me to see this. But later I can change those line thicknesses. So let's add another level for the next vertical grout. And here you can see it offsets it by a foot. And I'm just going to snap it up here to a foot. And it's not really, doesn't have anything to snap to. So I'll just type 12 and 12. And there's my next one. Let's go ahead and assign unique colors. And I'll add another level and do the same thing. And this time we'll make it 2 feet and 2 feet. And everything else is the same. We didn't change it. So everything gets, sort of unique colors. And there you go. There's my hatch pattern. I can zoom out or zoom in. I can use the cursor, the hand tool to move it around, or use the cursor tool to actually manipulate the control points. But I'm kind of a minimalist. If I can get a hatch with just 2 levels instead of 4, then I'm going to go that route. So I'm going to get rid of these last 2 levels. And this vertical grout, instead of having it just go up 2 courses, I'm actually going to offset it by about a foot. Right. So I'll make this 12 inches, and I'll make that 12 inches. And you can see that it's now still only 1/3 of the 3 feet. So it repeats after 3 courses. That's the 1/3 dash factor there. And then it's horizontal, and it just kind of stair steps up and to the right, up and to the right. So I've eliminated 2 levels. That doesn't really matter, except, to me, because I've got kind of a thing about that. So let's go ahead and set the line weight to something very light, because I don't want this to be overpowering, and maybe a light gray, medium gray, and make everything the same color and the same thickness. And then I can even give it a background fill, some slight off-white color. And there you go. You can see very simple hatch, right? And there it is. Now I can create hatches that are more complicated. Here's one that's sort of a random course pattern. So let's look at how I did that. So here you can see I've got almost a dozen levels, and that's just a series of horizontal lines. Let me zoom back or pan around so that you can see. So in this case, level 1 has a 5-foot repeat. So that's from the origin to this point, and then it's 0.7 long. And this one has a 4-foot repeat, and it's 0.9 long. And then the third one, so I've just have a couple of horizontal lines, and then lots of vertical lines and more horizontal lines. And they're deliberately set to these dash factors to give it this sort of skipping pen, sort of light kind of rendering style for showing coursed random ashlar stone. And then someone, not me, made a hatch like this, which is a wood grain. And so here you can see there are 41 levels. So that was quite a feat to get all of this to work out. And because the hatch editor doesn't allow you to draw in the Vectorworks drawing environment, but you can only draw within the hatch environment, it makes creating hatches like this wood grain extremely challenging. So thankfully, we've got lots of hatches that are out there in the DWG, DXF, AutoCAD, Vectorworks worlds. And so here's a file that I'm referenced in. And these are some DWG hatches that I just found online years ago and just imported. And again, even things that look like they might be curves, if you zoom in, you can see that these are all straight lines because hatches are always composed of straight line segments, and you can use those to approximate curves, but they're never actually going to be truly curves. And for some applications, that's just fine. But it's another sort of limitation of hatches. Now, in order to apply a hatch to something, I've got a couple of options, right? I could just draw, say, a rectangle or any kind of a surface. And then from the attributes, I could just choose hatch, and all the hatches in my document are then available to apply to that surface. Right? Here's that tile that we just created. And this is what I call a dynamic hatch. In other words, as the object is reshaped or changed in some way, that hatch follows it along and is applied to it. And in fact, the hatch doesn't really change at all. If I just move the object just a little bit, it's as if it's a window and you're seeing out beyond to this infinite plane of that hatch. And the reason for that is that the hatch is using its starting point, its origin, is the drawing origin. So you'll remember when we started this hatch, I had a start point for level 1. So that XY coordinate is going to be, in this case, of a hatch that's an attribute of a surface, whether it's a circle or a polygon, a polyline, rectangle, whatnot. It's going to use the drawing origin right over here as the basis for the hatch. Now, another way I can apply a hatch is with a hatch menu command. And you'll find that under the modify menu generally, unless you've got a different workspace going. And there it is, hatch. And here you can see, this is that dialog box that I screen captured over here. You can see that it shows all of the hatches within your current document up here. And then you've got some default content below. That's just from the Vectorworks libraries. Lots of hatches that come sort of pre-loaded, shipped with Vectorworks, right? So I'll go ahead and apply the hatch that we just created. And when I do that, I get this paintbrush icon. And now wherever I click will be the origin of the hatch. So there it is, and you can see it's applied there. Now what's happening here is when I do that, if I grab and drag this away, you can see that this is actually not a dynamic hatch like what we have up here, which moves. It's an attribute of the surface object. It moves with it. This is a group. It's a group of lines that were created using the same rules that generate this hatch. So I call this a static hatch because once you've hatched something, it's not going to change, right? Let me select that. Again, modify hatch, choose my hatch, decide on the origin point, right? If I take that rectangle and move it or reshape it, let me actually grab the rectangle. You can see the hatch doesn't go with it. On the other hand, I can't snap to the components of this hatch here. You know, if I try to snap to it, I'm not snapping, but you can see that I'm snapping to all the endpoints of the static hatch because it's just a group of lines. So generally speaking, attaching the hatch as an attribute of an object, a dynamic hatch, is usually preferable, but not always. Sometimes you want to go ahead and have a static hatch. It just depends on the situation. The major advantages of hatches are that there's a large library of available hatches, either dedicated to Vectorworks or DWG or DXF or AutoCAD hatches that you can import into Vectorworks. They're pretty straightforward. Everybody understands them. The disadvantage is that they're 2D only with one exception, and they are frankly a little challenging to create from scratch and edit, particularly for a very, very complex hatch or something that has some curvature. And then the last sort of limitation that I think is pretty significant is that, again, hatches are lines only, they're not curves. So in order to resolve some of these limitations, we have another device for this kind of two-dimensional rendering, and those are tiles. And tiles are very different from hatches, kind of the same idea generally speaking, right? The first thing that you notice about these objects, these are just all rectangles that have a tile attribute assigned to them. And like hatches, tiles are resources that you can find and import and so forth from your resource manager. Here are all the tiles in this particular document. And unlike hatches, tiles can have fills, and they can be composed of things other than lines. They can be composed of any kind of surface, ovals, rectangles, polygons, polylines, circles, you name it. Those can all be incorporated into a tile. And then they're a lot easier to manipulate because there's no interface like the hatch editor. It's really more of a, like the Vectorworks drawing environment. So let's have a look at a simple one. Here's this, well, we'll go ahead and make one. Let's go ahead and make something that's very similar to that hatch we just made. Again, I'll go ahead and create a new tile, and I'll call it tile 12 by 36, 1/3 bond. Okay, you can see that again, have the option of making them page or world units, rotate in walls or in symbols like hatches, and they can have a background fill or not. Let's go ahead and give this kind of a medium gray background fill. And let's go ahead and edit that. And we're going to edit not the settings, which we just looked at, but the geometry. And when I do that, you can see that I'm inside this, this drawing environment. It says exit tile right over here. So I'll start by just drawing a rectangle. Let's make it 12 inches by 36. And I'll just pop it here. Let's go ahead and rotate that 90 degrees. Let's just redo that. Let's make it 36 by 12 so I don't have to do that rotation. There we go. Okay. And I'll go ahead and give it fill, say a light blue. And you can see when I do that, I have the original rectangle that I drew right there, rectangle. And then I have all these ghostly objects here, and those are the repetitions. So I can use the one on the left to define how far it drags, and you can see that all the other ones also drag accordingly. So I'll just snap to there. And then the one on top, I can snap over here, but now I've got a stacked bond, which is not what I want. So I can move that repetition. I can either use the heads up display to just make it 12 inches, right? That can be a little unpredictable. So I'll just, in this case, just insert a locus, and I'll move that over 12 inches. And then I'll just grab this one and just snap to the locus and then delete the locus. And so there you go. I just have a rectangle, and it's just going to be offset with these offset control ghosts. And go ahead and exit the tile. And like a hatch, I can just go ahead and from the attributes palette, assign the tile to it. And let's go ahead and choose the one that we just created. So there it is. And like the hatch, as I move it around, it's dynamic, right? If I want to, I can get a little more complicated with this. I can edit that geometry. Let's say I want to show the grout line, right? So I can go ahead and select that rectangle and offset it by, say, 1/8 of an inch, and offset to the inside there. And you can see now it's created this 1/4 inch grout line. Exit the tile. And now when I zoom in, you can see that it's revealed that grout line. I can do all sorts of things with it that I would expect any kind of drawing element. So, for example, I can play with the pen color, give it no pen color. I could assign, put another rectangle on it, maybe give that a gradient. Let's choose a different gradient. Give that, say, no outline, and then even give it some opacity. Right. So a lot more flexible than hatches, and even in black and white mode, that looks really great. So if I'm printing black and white for some CDs or something like that. So for most rendering jobs, really, a tile is probably preferable to a hatch. As you can see, you can create all sorts of patterns, and you can include curves within your hatches and so forth. I'm sorry, within your tiles, not within your hatchet. So generally speaking, that's going to be the way to go. There is one particular thing that hatches can do that tiles cannot do, and that is being applied to a Vectorworks texture. So let's have a look at that. So here's a simple piece of wall. It's got components for siding and stone. And you can see that when I render that with a shaded render, it just looks like Vectorworks textures. But if I do a hidden line rendering, you can see that now a hatch is being applied in lieu of the Renderworks texture. So let's have a look and see how that works. So the first thing you're going to want to do is in your RenderWorks textures, you'll want to go ahead and assign a hatch to that texture. So here's the texture editor. And you can see that at the bottom, it says edit surface hatch. Now, many textures ship and there's no surface hatch assigned to it. And some textures ship with a surface hatch. This is one that we made ourselves. So actually, I think we got the stone texture itself from Arrowway or Vectorworks, and then just added a surface hatch to it. So you just click on that, you pick all the available from one of the available hatches in your document, or you can browse the libraries, whatnot. And you can see that I get a preview where I see the hatch and then the RenderWorks texture and then the hatch over it. So I can zoom in with the magnifying glass tool here. And there's the hatch. Of course, these are actually two fairly different kinds of textures or patterns, so they don't exactly line up. I can scale it with these controls. I can change the origin either by dragging it with the cursor tool here. I can interactively scale it. Or I can type in an origin. Say 0, 0. And that probably only matters if I'm working with something that is a very precise coursing, like say brick, where I want, 3 bricks to 8 inches, something like that. And so once I've assigned my hatch and I've scaled it and overlaid it properly, I'll hit OK. And then likewise on this siding texture that we've got, you can see that I've got a surface hatch. This hatch is 4 inches, but we just can scale it. So here's the preview of the RenderWorks texture behind the hatch. So I can just drag that. So I could make the I and the J corresponds to the X and the Y. So that's just the local local X and local J. So if I make the J 2.5 inches, right? So you can see that's about 3 times too small. So let's just make that 7.5 inches. In fact, I've got a clue here because it says the texture size is 7.328. So for that to be the same scale, I'll just make that 7.328. And then I can hit OK. And now when I do a hidden line rendering, you can see that that texture is applied. And that's obviously useful for elevations and sections in construction documents where you don't want a rendered view, but you just want a line drawing only. And so that's the one limitation of tiles, is that you cannot use them for this kind of component surface hatching for walls and other 3D geometry. And then the last item I wanted to talk about today are stipples. So those are, unlike hatches and tiles, which are repetitive, stipples are actually random. And so the good news about that is that you can get a gravel or concrete pattern like this, for example, that really does look random, unlike, for example, our hatches. Let's zoom in and find a concrete hatch somewhere. Probably this one, right? So if I made this hatch big enough, you can see that it is going to repeat. So this element occurs again over here. This element occurs again over here. And so over a very small area, that's okay. But over a large area, it starts to be problematic. Just looks repetitive. So stipples, on the other hand, are totally random. That's the good news. So, but the bad news is that there's a calculation that Vectorworks has to do in order to randomize these stipple patterns. So just be aware that very large stippled areas can be problematic for your files. Probably best to limit them to small areas or details rather than, say, an entire site plan. I once had somebody who had a file that one day the file was just fine, and the next day when they tried to update their viewports, the file would crash every time. And what had happened is at the end of the day, they had drawn this large lawn area on their site plan and had used a stipple to represent that lawn area, which, you know, that's totally fine, except that that polygon was a planar object, not a screen object. And so when they were looking at a front elevation, that polygon was essentially just a horizontal line. But within that polygon were all of these stipple points that when Vectorworks would try to calculate them, since it was such a large area, it would just crash. So just be aware, stipples can be intense, but they're really great for what they do. So stipples, we'll just go ahead and create a new stipple here. I'll just, but my preferred method is to draw a rectangle and under AEC, create objects from shapes. And stipple is one of those options. And I won't delete the source shape. And it just goes ahead and it makes stipple for you, kind of the default setting. So if we look at the stipple settings, you can see that stipples can be composed of two layers or levels. So you can make a stipple of either lines and circles or lines and polygons or rectangles and circles, whatever. So let's go ahead and make one with where one repeated shape is a line. We'll make it 0.01. These are paper scale dimensions, anywhere from 0.01 to 0.03 with a maximum aspect ratio of 1. So they're short little tick marks. Maybe give it a density of 20. And when it gets to the edge, we can just either omit it, clip, or overlap. Let's just go ahead and omit. We'll randomly rotate them. So right now you see these are not randomly rotated. They're all going in the same direction. And because the stipple is a graphic representation, I'm not so concerned about world units. Paper scale units are fine. So if I hit OK, you can see I now have this nice random assortment of these short little lines. Let me go back to the stipple settings. I can add another shape. So let's go ahead and add rectangles. Let's make them anywhere from 0.2 to 0.4. Let's give them a maximum aspect ratio of 1, so they'll be more like squares. And now when I add a second shape, I get this mixed percentage. So let's make the stipple, say, 80% lines and 20% rectangles. Whichever value I input, it makes the other one the complementary amount, right? And then this stipple density applies to the stipple as a whole, as does coloring the stipple shapes. So if I'm going to randomly rotate the lines, I'll randomly rotate the rectangles and so forth. So everything up here is for shape 1 or shape 2, and then everything from stipple density down is for the stipple as a whole. These are quite large, so let's go ahead and change the stipple setting. Let's make that 0.5 0.02 and to 0.04. That's more like it. Right? And then like tiles and unlike hatches, stipples can have a fill to the individual elements, and I can assign a line weight, and if I edit the stipple again, I can go ahead and oh, I was thinking something else. Oh, so if I fade it from the edge, right, then as it approaches the edge, some of these things start to get clipped out, or the density goes down. Probably easier to see if I up the density here. So there's a slight kind of tapering off of the stipple at the edge. Okay, I'll skip the fade. And you can see that every time I make a change, it sort of re-randomizes the stipple. So it's constantly recalculating the stipple. Something to think about, right? So once I have a stipple and I like the way it looks, maybe I'll make one more little change here. Let's make this 90% lines and only 10% rectangle. So once I have that stipple, I can go ahead and save the stipple. We'll call it my stipple. And that gets saved as a symbol within your resource manager under a new folder called Stipples. There's my stipple. And so if I want to, I can just highlight this rectangle and apply the stipple to it. No, it just dropped it right in. Right. Now the stipple has a boundary whether you see it or not, and you can use the reshape tool to edit that boundary. But again, my sort of favorite way to do these is to just draw a polygon, whatever shape I want. And then from the AEC menu, create objects from shape, stipple. It always gives me that little default stipple, but I can just use my eyedropper tool to pick up those stipple settings and put them down. And that's actually, probably the easiest way to handle them. And of course, this polygon that I drew, I can also give it a fill. And so I can get effects like this. So saving the stipple is a good way to kind of keep it around. Honestly, just using the eyedropper tool to pick them up and put them down is another great way to work with them. So to recap, hatches, older, more legacy device. Limitation is lines only. Primary advantage is usable as a surface hatch in tandem with a Vectorworks texture, or RenderWorks texture. Tiles, graphically easier to work with, more flexible, a lot more options, but can't be applied as a surface hatch to three-dimensional objects like walls and whatnot. And then stipples, primarily non-repetitive, quite random, which can create some calculation problems if you aren't careful, if they're very large. I also had a attendee to one of our meetings share some hatches, and I'll go ahead and post a link to those in the YouTube page for this, so that you can download some additional hatches, as well as a link to a custom script, which allows you to take dwg.pat files, pattern files, and import them directly into Vectorworks instead of having to import them into an AutoCAD file and then export them as a DWG. So thanks very much, and until next time.